as part of Discover Islam Week, it's a week for creating open spaces for the discussion of Islam and Muslim culture. Today we bring you The Many Faces of Feminism, Religious and Secular Convergences.
Thank you. I'd like to introduce our moderator, Professor Ann Orloff. Professor Ann Orloff is a professor of sociology and political science at Northwestern and board of lady managers of the Columbian Exposition Chair at Northwestern. She received her PhD from Princeton in 1985 and her BA from Harvard University in 1975. At Northwestern, she works with the cluster in historical and comparative social sciences and program in gender and sexuality studies. Please help me in welcoming Professor Orloff.
Thank you very much. I'm really pleased to have been asked to moderate this panel because it's exactly what I find so fascinating, the many faces of feminism, and I'm looking forward to hearing our distinguished speakers. The panel speaks to debates about Islam and feminism, but also speaks to the question of debates among versions of feminism within and across different parts of the world and within different religious traditions as well as secular traditions. In North America and Europe, many have seen women's equality as an inevitable concomitant of modernization, rising education, economic development. They expected models of equality and rights developed in the West to be taken up by other countries and regions as they too developed along Western lines. Of course, these views have been disputed rather vigorously across the academy and in popular life on a number of fronts. And I want to point to a couple because it seems to me that they come together in very interesting ways in the work of our speakers and I hope in our discussion that follows. This idea that women's equality just comes directly out of some kind of economic development along Western lines has been disputed by the idea that it's actually political conflict that has brought us gender equality and women's rights to the extent that they do exist. They're not given, but won in the course of political struggle. And of course, this is true for all kinds of rights. And of course, this all further implies that there can be struggles among people who are looking to forward greater democratic rights. It's not an easy, simple path towards rights or women's equality. In terms of political conflict, feminism has been one of the major strands of the 20th century, indeed from the 19th century. The word feminism, I learned from Wikipedia, first appeared in the late 19th century. I had some idea that this might be the case. But of course, the ideas are older and deeper and more widespread. And when you ask people what it means to be a feminist, they give you things. You could have the flip answer of Rebecca West, that it's feminist is what you get called anytime you differentiate yourself from a doormat. You might have something a little bit more politically elevated and think about feminism as having struggled for an end to discrimination, for political inclusion, for equal rights. But of course, even that list, I would think, makes clear that the meanings of those things are not simple, easy, direct. They're disputed. And so feminism both came out of political conflict and contributes to it, both within its many strands and with other movements that have sought to broaden democracy. I think the other strand that interests me quite a lot in terms of thinking of the many faces of feminism is a group of perspectives or approaches that have been very important, again, both across the academy and in the wider world, which seek to bring more global perspectives to understandings of economic development, politics, and society. Sometimes people would refer to post-colonialism, highlighting a particularly important line of conflict in the modern world, and sometimes even invoke the idea of alternative modernities, seeking to highlight the idea that there are many different trajectories of economic development and social change, and that these have been conditioned on relations characterized by power differentials, by inequality, by Orientalism, racializing, that these things are part of what have characterized our modern world in which feminism and other movements emerged. So I think that also speaks to the many faces of feminism in the following way, that as global and international struggles for economic welfare and political equality, anti-colonialism especially, has unfolded, the question of women's situation has been very significant, not just because women are among the subjects or citizens involved or have participated in armed struggle, but because women's status has been politicized and taken as a symbol of many different things, of modernity, of tradition, of imperial imposition, or indigenous character. And so the situation of women, I think, can be a good index of political struggles in the modern world. Over the last 2 centuries, imperial projects have sometimes been justified in the name of saving backward women from their own society and culture. And some see continuation of these projects into the present, with Western feminists rescuing other women by asserting their rights and assuming that different practices necessarily imply lack of rights or acceptance of male dominance. So that's been an important strand within feminism that a number of people have contested. And I would say that it has been, especially in the last decade or two, significant and charged around questions of Islam and Western traditions. But others assert a pluralism with respect to practices freely chosen, asserting that items of clothing, for instance, do not automatically signal anything in terms of status. People like Saba Mahmood in her book Politics of Piety assert the possibility of different understandings of agency than those which have typically characterized Western feminism emerging out of a tradition of the French Revolution and so on. And people have pointed to important indigenous feminist traditions in other parts of the world. If we think of the French Revolutionary tradition or Wollstonecraft tradition as being indigenous in some ways to Europe, there have been other kinds of expressions that could be called feminist in other parts of the world. And these have been brought to the attention of those of us in the West that need to be thinking about these things, where we see people finding ways to express demands for equality, political and social inclusion in basic human rights in different idioms. So I think of people like Laila Ahmed or Fatima Mernissi. And certainly, one thing that I think is common across all of these new idioms and contestations is a common concern about basic human rights, health, livelihood, freedom from violence. These things still unite us even if we have differences about other items. Certainly for the conversations we need to have across the globe about women's rights and status, we need to be prepared for genuine dialogue and exchange. And I sincerely hope and expect that this panel will be a chance for that. So I'm very pleased to introduce our 2 speakers, and I'll introduce you both now if that's okay, and then each one of them will be speaking a little bit more than half an hour, and we'll have time for questions and answers. So our first speaker, do you have a preference about who's?
We were just asking who goes first.
I think Hind should go first? Okay, so we've solved a problem here. So Hind Makki, who's based here in Chicago, is an educator, consultant, and writer whose work is hosted on the Muslim channel at Patheos. She's worked extensively within the American Muslim community on civic integration, interfaith dialogue, and leadership development. She's got a long list of accomplishments, including participating in a Muslim youth project exchange program to the Netherlands, being a community outreach coordinator, developing the One Chicago, One Nation program, and as I was happy to find op-ed pieces in the New York Times and Al Jazeera English, and so I think it'll be exciting to hear her perspectives. Asifa Quraishi Landes? Okay. Is Associate Professor of Law at University of Wisconsin Law School, where she specializes in comparative Islamic and U.S. constitutional law, with a current focus on modern Islamic constitutional theory. She, too, has a long and impressive CV, and some of the highlights are a recent Guggenheim Fellowship that she got not too long after she completed her law degree at Harvard, has also been at Columbia Law School, the University of California at Davis, and UC Berkeley. She served as a law clerk in the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit. She's been an affiliate of the Muslim Women's League, Muslim Women Lawyers for Human Rights, and a member of the Opinion Leaders Network for the British Council's Our Shared Future project. So won't you join me in welcoming our speakers and get going.
All right, good evening, everybody. Is this working correctly and you all can hear me? Excellent. So I'm Hind. I'm the one who's not the law professor. I'm the community activist, and I was very excited and honored when the students reached out to me not too long ago to say that part of the Discover Islam Week was actually focusing on feminism and asking themselves this question of what are the many faces of feminism, and what do Muslim women ourselves say about what feminism is, and the relationship that feminism as an ideology, what we believe that has impacted our own religious traditions, and not just our beliefs, but essentially how has that impacted lives of Muslim women and men, not only in the United States but around the country, or around the globe, sorry. So what I'd like to do is just sort of paint some pictures for you, and I was asked to address a few questions, so I'm going to do that throughout my talk, and then of course in the Q&A session, which I'm very excited to engage with all of you a little later in the evening. But I want to start out actually telling you a little bit about my mother, who is amazing. And many of you who know me, know that I like to kind of create these portmanteaus, these words with other words. And one of my favorite ones is something called fabulady. And a fabulady is a lady who is fabulous. And not everybody gets to be a fabulady. But my mother is, I would consider, an original fabulady. And I would like to tell you why. She is a baby boomer, she's over 60 years old, and my family is from Sudan, which is a country like almost every other country in Africa, with the exception of Ethiopia, our neighbor, was colonized by European forces. In the case of Sudan, it was colonized by Britain for about 50 years with sort of Egyptian bureaucrats and technocrats doing some work as well on the ground. And then before the British came, Sudan was sort of a protectorate or part of the Ottoman Empire as well, although they had indigenous smaller kingdoms kind of loosely affiliated with themselves and with each other. And the reason I'm saying this is because I believe that over the last 100 to 150 years, sort of really in the modern era, the Muslim world and the European world engaged with each other in ways that are both positive and negative, but I would say negatively affected the situation of Muslim women. And I say this because in many of indigenous circles, for example, in Sudan, women before the advent of the Brits coming to Sudan with their Victorian ideals and their own understandings of what the role of women should be in society, women were, educated at least in terms of learning the alphabet and learning the Quran, very similar to a lot of the boys. So the girls and the boys would receive sort of similar education in that respect. However, when the British came and sort of incorporated these Victorian ideals into education, and not only that, but really had this societal impact that said that essentially we need to really help these poor black people to modernize, and the way we want to do that is through some of these more visual external visuals, and essentially what the role of women was in the public sphere. Then you have a lot of indigenous male leaders balking at that. And so what you had was where you had some, pre the British Empire, at least you had some of the upper classes of women, learning, studying, learning not only Arabic but other languages, participating in the family, participating in society and charitable funds and giving, and that kind of, sort of behavior and impact in their local society, what you had after the British came was a sort of imitation, and I would say a poor mimicry of the gender segregation and the understanding of what the role of a woman should be, importing these Victorian ideals. So then what happens is that, women are, I would say middle class and upper class women, because of course rural working class women, people don't seem to care too much about protecting their purity and trying to preserve their rights. But for the middle class and upper class women, they had to essentially start anew. And so my grandmother, my mother's mother, she was born in the 1930s to a middle class family. And she began her, early childhood in school. But she was not allowed to complete her education past, I believe, 2nd or 3rd grade. Not because her father was opposed to it, but because one of her cousin's fathers was opposed to it. And he said, well, what's the point of having these girls get a secular education, which is what the education at that point was. It was secular. If they're just going to get married, and we want them to get married anyway. So what's the point of having them, go to these either Catholic schools or these English or British schools? And so to kind of make sure that there was no chaos in the family, my grandmother was also taken out of school because her cousin was going to complain, oh, why does Zainab get to go to school but not me? And so my grandmother always wanted to continue on school. She was always very upset that she was essentially illiterate. I mean, she could write her name, she could do a little bit of reading and writing, but not very much. I mean, you would essentially describe her as being illiterate. She raised 6 children, 2 of them girls, women. My mother was one of them. And now we get to the post-colonial part of Sudan. So my mother in the 1970s and her sister after that were able to take advantage of the Sudanese laws after the British were, left, after the British were gone. And they were able to take these laws, which were very egalitarian, which we would consider to be egalitarian. When Sudan became independent, men and women could vote. You had to be a certain age, but if you were a woman, you were not banned from voting. Women were completely began to be incorporated into the workplace. And free education, compulsory education through high school was free, and then universities were also free. So my mother was able to get the best education in Sudan, free of charge to her family, and graduated with her fancy schmancy science degrees, came to the United States and continued on to receive a master's degree in biology. And my aunt had a similar trajectory as well. She's a chemist. So why am I saying this? It's very interesting because when my mother came to the United States, she came in 1979, so in the heyday of kind of, Western feminism and some of the gains that American feminists had made, she came to the United States and was shocked as she was looking for a job that a woman's wage in the United States was not equal to a man's wage. Because in Sudan, this developing African country that she had come from, she earned the exact same wage that any of her male colleagues had earned, and she didn't think this was a religious question. She just thought this was a very basic kind of human rights thing. If you're doing the same work, you should receive equal pay. And she was surprised that America, which is the most advanced country and the most powerful political and social cultural force in the 20th century, that this was that she had to sort of push back against these ideologies and these beliefs that she didn't even have to do in Sudan, her own home country, which is and remains to be a conservative, observant, practicing Muslim community. I mean, most Sudanese people are, I would phrase, to be very conservative in their approach to Islam and are very religious in that sense. So, I wanted to tell you this story because I wanted to give you a framework of who some Muslim women and Muslim women leaders might be. So I gave you a little bit of background about my mother, and today this is a woman who, she drives, she owns her own house, she has, these higher education degrees, she's a teacher, she speaks 2 languages. By any means, most people would say this is a liberated woman. people might say even that her focus on education, because she's a teacher, and her focus on teaching young women and giving them the tools to succeed in life after they graduate from high school, that she is promoting feminism. But if you ask her, are you a feminist? She would say, no, I'm not a feminist. Why aren't you a feminist, Mom? Well, because I believe that men and women are different. I don't want to erase our differences. And here you have often many religious Muslim women, from my experience and from the studies that I have read, would say the same thing. They might, in their action and in the reality of their day-to-day life, promote a space and promote a society where women and men are in the public space equally, are equally encouraged to be educated, are equally encouraged to have an impact in their society, but still she doesn't want, and that this is the base understanding, that men and women must have equal rights under the law and under both divine law and under secular law, but still she does not want to be called a feminist. And I find that very interesting. And again, this question of what are the many faces of feminisms, I think is very critical for any of us who are interested in not just women's rights, but in human rights, and thinking about international development around the world and development here in the United States, and national security, not in terms of politics, but in terms of, do the citizens of our own country feel safe in their homes? Do they feel secure on their campuses? Do they feel safe as protected citizens of this country? Do they feel equal to the male citizens who are their neighbors? And here I think we can really look at some recent trends of what I might term as, many might term as Western feminism. And Professor Orloff, you mentioned a brief overview of from the 19th century onward until about the 1970s. And I think it's really, really important to understand that, feminism and the fight for equality and equal rights is something that is not defined the same, right, for different groups of people and at different times. And one person who I think probably many of you, if not all of you in this room, are familiar with is Bell Hooks, who is, of course, a feminist, a human rights activist, who, kind of shifted the paradigm a little bit in the 1980s. She's African American, and she, essentially said, yes, as a woman, I'm very concerned about my rights as a woman, and in that sense, I'm a feminist, but I'm also African American, and there's an intersectionality there. I not only care about being a feminist, but I care also about uplifting African Americans, uplifting people of color, uplifting people who might be living in economically deprived situations, and so on and so forth. And here this shifted the paradigm, because the conversation up until that point was really one of, it was almost a luxury of upper class or middle upper class white women who were educated, who came from a certain cadre of the United States or of Western Europe. And here she is saying, well, actually my experiences are different. Not that I don't believe in equality for everybody, not that I don't feel like my movement is not part of the movement of white feminists, but that there is also another twist to my identity. There's another, there's a biculturality. And here I think is really important when you look at Muslim women around the world, in their gains as well as in the challenges that they face, is that there is a biculturality there. There is not just biculturality and a biraciality there, but they're also thinking about, what does it mean to be a woman in my particular society? And, of course, as we all know, Muslim women and, the Islamic world is not a monolith. And if you just look at right here in the United States, we have the most racially diverse Muslim community in the world. We are the most diverse in terms of sectarian division. We're the most diverse in terms of what racial or ethnic background people have come from. And we're also the most racially diverse religious group in the United States. And within this diversity, you also have economic diversity, political diversity, and naturally you will have different women who prioritize different things. And I don't think it behooves anybody to say, well, this person who cares about, something that 90% of Western feminists might agree upon is the Muslim feminist whom we should, support and celebrate and fet as what all Muslim feminists should be like, or pro-feminists should be like from the Muslim community. I don't think it behooves and really serves the feminist movement at all to say, well, women who wear a headscarf, or women who believe that their rights are God-given and not, naturally sort of given in a secular environment, that these types of women should not be part of the feminist movement. And I think this actually hinders and not helps the feminist movement. I was asked to discuss a little bit about Femin. I don't know if any of you are familiar. Who here is familiar with this group, Femin, F-E-M-N? Oh, okay, about a third of you, a little over a third of you. So this is a group, they call themselves sextremists. Yeah, you heard that right. And they come out of the Ukraine, which of course is sort of dealing with their own really deep problems right now. But they do come out of a communist culture and society that had for almost a century repressed religion and religiosity, outward religiosity, as well as engendering a sort of understanding that, the communists did, that men and women are completely equal. And so this group of these feminine activists, they're young women who, in fact, we'll put a peg on that, but they promote themselves as young women who come out of the Ukraine, from Kiev and other places in the Ukraine, and their interest is in essentially saving and protesting for the rights of women around the world, and specifically Muslim women. And they emerge out of the Ukraine. Of course, after the communists fell, the church rose up again. And the Orthodox Church and the Catholic Church in the Ukraine essentially, on a pendulum swing, swung the other way. So over 70 years, religion was repressed in the country. Well, now that the communists are gone, the church is going to try to, take back essentially what they believed that they had lost. And in many ways, again, that was also curtailing or trying to curtail the rights of women that they had enjoyed throughout the entire, 20th century under the communists. And so these feminine groups, these feminine women, they're coming out of this particular situation where they had enjoyed rights under a secular regime, even though the communism, of course, has many, many pitfalls. And then the religious cadre came, and they saw that they had to fight again for their political rights again. And they, living under, behind the curtain wall, or what is it, the Iron Curtain. It's really strange to talk about communism again, but we're talking about communism again because of what's happening in the Ukraine. But sitting behind that Iron Curtain, they were not part of, that movement that I was talking about with bell hooks and some of the women of color and white women allies of these movements of really thinking about intersectionality. So these women in the Ukraine are completely not part of that conversation. But what they see is that they see Muslim women around the world being attacked, being oppressed, and these are real things. I mean, there are murders around the Muslim world where people call them honor murders for no reason, because it's not honorable. There are situations where women are being oppressed in the name of Islam, right? So it's not like they're coming out, the feminists coming out of this from nowhere. They're seeing the situation, and they see that the most visible distinction of a Muslim woman is what she is wearing. And so what they decided to do, and this is based off of what they had started already in the Ukraine against the Catholic and the Orthodox churches there, is that, again, they're extremists. So they go in front of a sacred space, whether that's a civil sacred space like a courtroom or parliament, or they go in front of a religious sacred space like a mosque or a church, and they literally take off their shirts and they write, their messages on their bare chests. And so last year in 2013, they decided to have an international topless jihad day, where they would go and they would invite, their supporters in they were primarily in Western Europe, although there were some in North America as well, to go in front of mosques and to say that this is an international day to just yell out our support and show our support for Muslim women. And the reason they did that is because a member of their group in Tunisia had recently been arrested because she had taken a photograph of herself naked as well, and writing on her chest that something about human rights, because of course Tunisia is also undergoing many social and cultural political upheavals at this time, although I'm going to end with Tunisia, so that's on hopefully a lighter note. But in any case, this Tunisian woman who comes from a Muslim background was arrested for taking this picture, which she had uploaded on, I think maybe Facebook or something on the social media. And her feminine cohort decided that to show their support for her, they were going to go in front of these mosques and try to go into some of the mosques, take off their clothes, and express their support for Muslim women in that way. The problem with that, or one of the many problems with that, is that they didn't connect with local Muslim feminist groups, educational groups. They didn't connect with Tunisian feminist groups. In fact, the Tunisian feminist groups actually publicly disavowed the actions of Femin, and they said this has nothing to do even with this woman's case, Amina's case, because that is a case about freedom of speech. It's not really a case about religion or anything like that. It's about, does she have the right to say what she said and write what she wrote and put it online. They did not connect with any feminist or Muslim educators around the world that they were supposedly fighting for and saying, what are you already doing on the ground and how can we support you? What they said was, Muslim women are slaves to their men. And I mean, if you could actually look at a letter that their spokeswoman had written, that Muslim women are slaves to their men, and that is shown because they're covered, and why would anyone want to choose to be covered? And we want to support them, and they should be like us. When they received pushback, they didn't take that very well. They said, well, you're brainwashed, Muslim women. You clearly don't know. You should be like us. And so here's a classic example of, a group of feminists or activists who are saying, my face of feminism is the face of feminism. And if you don't agree with me, then you're brainwashed. Not you're maybe going on a different path, or, your culture might have different understandings of what protection of civil liberties and civil rights are, not, what is the nuances, and these Muslim religious scholars who are women are really diving into the traditional texts of Islam and looking into, how Islamic law is being developed, and I'm sure Professor Landis is going to, review that. But, there are many Muslim women around the world, and probably in the Ukraine itself, who are trying to, uplift the situation of themselves and of their sisters. And here, again, I think what a lot of Muslim women felt was, here's Femin again, another sort of Western European, actually they're not, they're Eastern Europeans, but, taking this sort of imperialistic understanding, like, we're going to save you. And there's a really great line by an Indian philosopher and activist, Gayatri Spivak. Many of you might be familiar with it. And she said that essentially what the Europeans try to do with women in the developing world, not just Muslim women, but women from the global South, is that it's essentially white men saving brown women from brown men. And and I think it's very important when we think about activities and actions that we want to mobilize around, whether it's something like female genital mutilation, which I think most people can agree is a bad thing, or it's, supporting Malala Yousafzai in her efforts to extend education in her region, and not just in her region, but she's working with Syrian refugees in Lebanon and elsewhere in the Middle East, whether it's, protecting the rights of Muslim women who live in a place like France and they want to work, but they can't work because they wear a hijab. I think it's very important to really think about what is our role as, allies or within the group itself, as we think about the many faces and the nuances of what feminism is. I don't think, as Professor Orloff, alluded to, I don't know that everybody is ever going to agree that there's one definition of what feminism is, but I think most people could generally agree that feminism is a movement that works toward the protection of the rights of women and girls, and to build equality in societies around the world wherever possible, and to promote that and to protect that, and to really incorporate that in the legal, in the law, as well as in the cultural and the social norms of every society. And I think this is really critical for anybody who considers themselves to be a feminist or a pro-feminist or pro-womanist, and whatever racial, religious, ethnic, and economic background that you come from. I promised you that I would talk a little bit about Tunisia, because I think this is a bright spot. But before we talk about Tunisia, I want to get a little bit back into this idea of white men saving brown women from brown men. When I began my talk, I discussed a little bit about, colonization. And a lot of times Muslims, when they talk about the rise of, modern movements such as Islamism in the Middle East or in South Asia, they will go back to colonization. And I think it's really critical to do that. But I also think it's critical to think about, our own living history. Iraq and Afghanistan are still going on, and many of you might remember, maybe you don't remember, depending on how old you are, but the justification for both of those wars ended up often being that we need to protect the women, we need to save the women from the Taliban. I mean, Cherie Blair said this, Laura Bush said this outright. It became part of the international narrative around why we invaded Iraq and Afghanistan. And so this isn't, when I discuss this sort of difficult relationship between the Muslim world, the traditional Muslim world, and the West as it is defined, sort of this nebulous kind of Europe, North America, Ukraine somehow, it's still going on, and many Muslims are still viewing it from this particular lens. So as we think about that, I think it's really, we would be remiss if we didn't also think about what the Arab uprisings mean for women throughout the Middle East. And we won't know what the outcome of the Arab uprisings is, maybe for another 50 years, maybe even after that, we don't know. We're still working in the United States on our own political experiment. So we really, I don't think it's fair to say 2 years after or 3 years after the uprisings began in Tunisia and then Egypt and Yemen that they have failed, right? Clearly, these societies are still going through many challenges, whether that's a civil war that we see in Syria, whether that's essentially a breakdown of society, unfortunately, in Libya, whether it's kind of a return to the old in Bahrain or Yemen. And then Egypt, of course, we know that's always constantly in the news, where it's a back and forth, and they had a military coup recently. And the country is becoming even more regressive and repressive. But Tunisia is a little bit of a bright spot. And the reason I say this is because they recently finalized, after years and many months of negotiation and collaboration between or among Islamists, secularists, nationalists, people who were exiled for 20 years, people who had remained, communists. They worked out what has been described as the most progressive constitution in the world right now. And so they recently ratified it, I believe, last month in January. And you can actually find this, an English translation of this. What is very interesting about the case of Tunisia is that when they had their elections after the fall of the military dictator, the Islamists won, essentially by a landslide. And everybody freaked out. Oh my God, the Islamists. Like, Tunisia had been, it was a secular country for all of its independent years. And either because of that or, in addition to that, women in Tunisia enjoyed some of the most liberal rights, legal rights in the Middle East. And you might even say in Africa and perhaps throughout the Muslim world. In terms of family law, in terms of divorce law, and sort of these religiously derived laws that are often used to repress women. In Tunisia, they didn't have that particular problem with women, although they had sort of the opposite problem. If you were outwardly religious, you couldn't, like in France, you couldn't get jobs and you weren't being able to be promoted, etc. However, when the Islamists, won these free and democratic elections, people, as I mentioned, they freaked out. They said, are we going to roll back the rights that Tunisian women currently enjoy? What's going to happen? Are they going to force women to wear headscarves and all sorts, and all that kind of fear mongering? And some of it was legitimate because you don't know. Well, what will the Islamists in Tunisia do? And what they did essentially was say, okay, we're going to actually have a transitional government. And the spokesperson of the Islamists is in fact a woman. And many of the people who were elected as part of An-Nahda, which is the Islamist party, were women, whether they came from Tunisia or they came with the representatives from Europe, because they had dual citizenships. And these women were part and parcel of this conversation of how do you enshrine in the Constitution these rights. And not only were women's rights not rolled back, but there were gains to be had, because here now you have even religious women, observant women, their rights were being protected. And it's also, I believe, the only constitution in the world right now that actually has environmentalism and protecting the environment as part of its national constitution. So I'm going to end here, and I'm excited to hear what Professor Qureshi Landis has to offer with us, and I'm excited also to engage with you in the Q&A, and I'm just going to step away now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm very excited and honored to be here, and thank you to the MCA and to Noha, where's Noha, who worked so hard. We were working back and forth until we were able to work it out so that I could come. So thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here. I'm going to share with you the culmination of several years of my own work in Islamic law, writing in Islamic law, teaching in Islamic law, and also working in areas of women's rights in my own personal life and sometimes professional life, and in both secular and Muslim environments, and a growing frustration that I had been finding over the years. I was in Beijing in 1995 for the UN World Conference on Women, watching the interaction with the secular and Muslim feminist work, and I'll talk about the problematics of using that word in the first place. But basically, I finally wrote this all down in an article that's available to you if you're interested, and I'm going to share with you some of my insights from there. And basically, the main thing that was so frustrating was I was seeing not just a misunderstanding of, as you guys are putting it, the many faces of feminism, but actually efforts by quote unquote secular, Western, whatever you want to call it, feminist work, global feminist work, global women's rights work, actually backfiring and actually hurting the very women they said they were trying to help. And not only that, they were very much oblivious to this fact. So I'm going to start and end with a story. I'm going to start with a story and end with a different story that I think encapsulates my experiences on this. So back when I was just out of law school, I wrote an article critiquing the rape laws of Pakistan. So Pakistan, I'm going to talk a little bit more, has since 1979 a Hudud ordinance which legislated, codified some of the Islamic criminal law. And in a nutshell, it included some stuff that I had critiques of based on my Islamic law research. And so I critiqued that, in particular the area of their codification of rape. Because I had written that, I was contacted by a loose collection of what they call themselves progressive Muslim activists around the world when a case showed up in Nigeria where a similar kind of legislation codification of Islamic criminal law was going on. The particular case, some of you follow the Nigeria zina cases, this is extramarital sex prosecution. You probably have heard of the famous Amina Lawal. That's a more familiar name. The case I was asked to work on is a different woman named Baria Magazu, but same province and similar kinds of facts, except that she was not married, so it was a little bit different. She was an unwed pregnant woman. But the problem was that she was being prosecuted for extramarital sex, for sex outside of marriage, purely because she was unmarried and pregnant. And so because of my work on this topic in Pakistan, I was asked to write a brief, basically, to try to help her avoid punishment. The reason I was asked was because the governor of Zamfara, her province, had been bombarded by international feminist, women's rights, human rights activists around the world, pressuring him and her, whoever was in authority on the legal team to release her. It was barbaric. It was a violation of human rights. It was a violation of UN values, of women's rights, and it was so much pressure that he finally publicly said that he would no longer hear any human rights-based arguments on this question. The fact that he put it that way made these guys and women say, I wonder if he would listen to an Islamic law argument for her clemency, and so that's why they contacted me. And so I wrote up a brief, and as I was finishing the brief, we had about a week or two before the next phase of the execution of the punishment was going to be carried out. She was under potential punishment of flogging. As I'm finishing the brief, I get a call from a good friend of mine who says, they flogged her, they did it. And I said, what are you talking about? We have another week. Well, I was just about to send this. And I turn on NPR, and indeed, they had moved up the punishment. But the governor himself said he moved it up because of all of this international pressure. So she was, in fact, flogged, even though her case was still on appeal. And so this is what Aisha Imam, the director of Baobab, one of the women's rights organizations in Nigeria, which works based on secular arguments, Islamic law arguments, etc. This is a quote from her. She says, Ms. Magazu's sentence was quite illegally brought forward without notice, despite the earlier assurance of the trial judge that the sentence would not be carried out for at least a year. The extra-legal carrying out of the sentence was not despite national and international pressure, it was deliberately to defy it. Thus, we would like you, and she's appealing basically to the world community of activists, we would like you to recognize that an international protest letter campaign is not necessarily the most productive way to act in every situation. On the contrary, women's rights defenders should assess potential backlash effects before devising strategies. So this was my first introduction to how this stuff can actually really backfire when there isn't communication, isn't understanding of nuance, and not really carefully thought out strategy. So strategy matters. And so as I started putting my thoughts together for this talk, I was thinking strategy is one of the faces of feminism. This is how you present your arguments to the world. What are your choices? How do you prioritize what you're going to say? And so strategy is a face that you need to think about. And strategy matters. And what I've been seeing is a lack of really respectful and thoughtful strategy when it comes to women's rights, especially trying to help Muslim women in particular. So one of these problems, I think, comes from the lack of strategy, comes from, and I'm sensitive to this because it's my field, is a lot of presumptions about Sharia, or Sharia, if you're speaking American, Islamic law. There is a presumption in a lot of the women's rights, secular feminist rights, world community, whatever you want to put it, that Sharia is bad for women, just full stop. And so most of the efforts around the world are trying to figure out, well, how can we rescue and save these women from Sharia? Keeping them, opposing legislation that looks like it's Sharia-based legislation. And so that's something I want to address tonight real briefly. Isn't it? Isn't Sharia bad for women? I've heard random people see me, taxi drivers, and when I'm going places, that there is this widespread attitude that this is part of the problem. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the areas that people immediately think about when they think about Islamic law and women, and then I want to talk about possible responses to some of these things. So some of the major areas of concern, as I mentioned, is criminal law. So there's actual prosecution for things like extramarital sex, where it's a criminal prosecution, by the way, for both men and women. It's not just women. And that is Quranically based. And it's complex as far as how it gets carried out. Many people don't realize that you actually need 4 eyewitnesses to the actual intercourse in order to prosecute somebody for extramarital sex, for zina. How are you going to get those 4 witnesses is really shows that it's incredibly unlikely to be able to prosecute it based on that. But one of the challenges I found when dealing with Nigeria is that there is one school of Islamic thought, and I'm going to give a little bit more details about what I mean by school. There's one school of Islamic legal thought that actually allows prosecution based only on circumstantial evidence of basically pregnancy outside of marriage. And so that one school happens to dominate in the North African continent, and so that was what I was dealing with in that case. Even in that situation, there's legal arguments you can still make for someone not to be prosecuted and punished. There's many areas in family law that are pointed to see, this is where Sharia is bad for women. There's a lot of areas where a lot of sort of fudging the rules for consent happens with the allowance of child marriage, families marrying off their children at very young ages, both boys and girls, but the kicker with girls is that they don't have the same access to divorce that boys do. So men under classical Islamic law have a unilateral access to right to divorce that basically if a boy is married off against his will, he just would use that and then he's out of it. A woman or a young girl would have a much harder time accessing divorce. Thankfully, she can have a divorce, but there's many more hoops that she would have to go through. Just the fact that polygamy is acknowledged and allowed, that's often pointed to as one of the areas where Sharia is a problem. There's many ways that individual legal scholars and sometimes leaders in the community have found ways to argue that even domestic violence might be okay at some limited level, maybe some kind of reprimand, maybe not that would harm you, but certain sense of authority of the man over the woman as far as obedience and telling her how to behave, that kind of thing, which then it escalates into domestic violence, and so it becomes a very problematic area to exclude altogether. I mentioned divorce. I mean, access to divorce is easier for men than it is for women, and so there's a serious challenge there. Also, child custody after marriage, after a divorce, often is very gendered. It's very based on the gender, the sex of the child, the sex of the parent, and it's sort of very solidified and less nuanced than people would tend to want in our modern era, at least in the West. So these are some of the pinpoint areas where many people point to saying, see, this is not equal. This is not treating men and women equally, and women have a harder time, and therefore we need to overcome this. So can any of this be changed? Well, this takes a little bit, not much, but a little bit of basic understanding of Islamic law. And so if you take a little bit of time, you actually right away find out that the fundamental building block of all of Islamic jurisprudence is an awareness by the jurist who wrote the legal doctrine that they were fallible, that they were human beings, and the work they were doing could potentially be wrong in the eyes of God. And there's no way to know for sure until we're all dead. And so what happens is you end up with many, many, many different interpretations of what the meaning of the Quranic texts are, the prophetic example is, and that leads to many different particularized differences in the particular rules that would apply in how you get married, how you get divorced, what kind of prosecution you need for a zina case, et cetera, et cetera. And that's what I meant by schools of law. As time went on, they evolved into several different methodologies of understanding those original scriptures, and you end up with several different approaches. And so one of the things that's really important to recognize is most of these rules that I'm describing are coming out of that process of ijtihad is the word that's used, of legal understanding and interpretation of the sources. And so anything that's not clearly, definitively given one meaning in the Quran or the hadith, the story of the prophet you're looking at, it's a creation of human beings. It's a creation of jurists who themselves recognize that we might be wrong at this. And so much of what we need to think about is looking at, as she said, diving into the original legal text and saying, how much of this is humanly created? And on what basis were they creating it? What presumptions were they coming to the text with that might have changed in our society that were there for them but are different for us? How much of this is negotiable? Without an understanding of Islamic jurisprudence, people are not aware of this. They're given Islamic law as if it's monolithic, it's one code, there's one answer for each question. In fact, there's usually more than one answer for each question. When I hear somebody say, the Islamic law is this, I'm immediately skeptical that they really haven't done their research. There's probably several different, at least there's for sure probably a minority opinion and probably several different dissenting opinions among the schools. You usually are not getting the whole story if somebody tells you the Islamic law is this. So what's really interesting about this to me and to many of the women that Hind mentioned is that Muslim women who are and men, but those Muslims who are interested in women's rights are really taking the idea of the difference between Sharia and fiqh. Fiqh is the word we use to describe the actual rules that are developed by the scholars that are the actual legal doctrine. Sharia is the ideal. This is what we're trying to get to, God's law. The actual articulation and understanding of that is fiqh. The word fiqh literally means understanding. So my classic metaphor when I teach Islamic law is think of Sharia as a recipe. We can't taste a recipe. You can only taste each chef's interpretation of that recipe, and each one's going to taste slightly different. This one uses local ingredients, this one stirs it just this way, but it's still the same recipe. So the fiqh is what many Muslim women and Muslims in general working on women's rights are focused on. They see the difference between Sharia and fiqh and say, okay, this part over here is this chef used, local ingredients that I don't like or that we don't have anymore, and so therefore we need to use these local ingredients. And so this allows for change that isn't changing or challenging Islam itself. It's just a continuation of Islamic law within a new context, which has always happened throughout Islamic history. So women's rights activists, from a Muslim perspective, very Sharia-mindful perspective, are taking this seriously and looking at where are the areas that we can rethink some of this stuff and then populating that. They're actively engaged in that, and they're challenging some of these rules that I described, the unilateral access for men to have access to divorce and a woman not to. Maybe there's a different way of coming up with a marital relationship that isn't obedience-based, but maybe it could be another model of the marital contract. Maybe we could have different bases of child custody arrangements that aren't so strict on the tribally identified groupings that we want to preserve within the protection of a child. And to do this, you have to know something about Islamic law. You have to know really good Arabic. You have to have studied the Quran. In other words, you have to have an Islamic legal education. So when she talked about her grandmother being able to read Arabic, that was her entrance into the tool of her own empowerment. And when you take that away, these women do not have access to their own ability to challenge the very rules that they're being told this is God's law, when actually it's not. It's a human understanding of God's law, and I'm a human too. And if I have the education that allows me to do the research just as much as this other scholar did, now I can have a conversation on equal footing, and we can really look at this with respect, but openness to the fact that we're all human and we're all fallible, and we're all really in this to try to do the best we can to understand and articulate God's law for us. So that's there's a famous woman scholar here in the West who keeps insisting that Islamic education is a human right. And that is an oxymoron to a Western feminist. Because Western feminists, the image of Islamic education is like madrasas that the Taliban set up that are like, the kids are like memorizing with no brain at all. But actually, if you think about it, if you take this stuff seriously, you can't even enter that conversation unless you actually have access to an Islamic legal education. And if you take that away, you are disempowering that entire population of men and women to be able to rethink these rules. And they're only going to be able to regurgitate the rules that have been handed down for generations without really understanding that they actually are human creations. So fluency in Islamic law is crucial to be able to challenge the patriarchal customs that are being called Islam, but are actually variations on human understanding of their practices. It often instills new self-confidence in Muslim women when they have this education. It gives them the ability to have basic conversations with their father. Actually, Dad, actually, Baba, Islam, I have a right to an education. See, right here in the Quran it says that. And look at all these Muslim women scholars who had an education and taught men scholars. And so I really should be able to go to school, and so should Zainab. And so should, that's the kind of conversation that, depending on the family, will have more play than, in this UN human rights document right here, it says that I have the right to, many of the families I'm engaged with, it doesn't mean anything to them. But if you argue that this is divine law, now you have traction in a place that you otherwise wouldn't have anywhere to go. Now, not everybody's open to reform, after all. I mean, that does take change, and many people's interpretation of Islamic law are not as open to reform ideas and changing some of this. They're very comfortable with the rules as they are. Not to worry. There's a lot in the established classical doctrine of Islamic law that's actually quite empowering to Muslim women. And again, many of these areas are things that secular, Western, global, however you want to call it, feminism, women's rights activism, not aware of, or at least doesn't take seriously enough to really make much of a difference. So just to make a list here, classical Islamic law insists that women, as men, have a right to an education. In fact, the responsibility of the community to give everybody an education. The right to own her own property. This is leaps and bounds ahead of women's rights in Europe. not only does she have her right to own her own property and inherit her own property, but her property has no man in her life has any claim over her property. Her husband, her brother, her father. If it's in her name, if it's her property, it's hers. And that's classical Islamic law. The right to be on the front lines in combat service. From the beginning, some of these women were right next to the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and fighting in combat. That's something only just very recently American women have had access to as a right. Something many people don't realize this is that there is nothing in the classically established Islamic marriage contract doctrine that would expect or require a wife to do housework, cooking, or cleaning. In fact, some of the jurists have read this to say, well, if she comes from a family where she's not used to that sort of thing, then the husband has to either do it himself or pay for someone to do it for her. So this classical understanding, the wife is the one at home and she's cooking and cleaning, the husband's the breadwinner, really isn't by definition part of an Islamic marriage contract. Yeah, there's other challenges to the classical Islamic marriage contract that might not fit with our sense of empowerment today, but that's not one of them. This idea that you have to be home cooking and cleaning is not part and parcel of classical Islamic marriage contract. Even with the domestic violence challenges, still all the jurists insist you may not harm your wife. You may not physically harm them to any point where there is actually any showing of harm. So et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You can go on with many, many areas of financial empowerment by the Islamic property laws. The mahar that you get upon marriage could be a tool of financial empowerment for women, et cetera. You could use and look at a lot of the classical doctrine, not talking about reform at all, to empower Muslim women to get out of very difficult situations in their home life. And in fact, much of the heavy lifting in improving the lives of Muslim women that is being done by Muslim women's activism is using that stuff, is using classically established things that you cannot challenge because it's so classically entrenched in the doctrine. And so their efforts are to educate Muslim women about their classically established rights. The work that's being done on the reform level I find very interesting and curious. But it's usually not the mainstream when you're looking at activism on the ground as far as what is being done to help Muslim women. Here's how you write your marriage contract so that it's not polygamous. Here's how you make sure that you have enough money to take care of yourself if you end up by yourself after divorce or something like that. So all of this work is a face of feminism, if you want to call it feminism. As she said, and as I'll talk about in a little bit, many Muslims don't want to call it feminism. But if you are thinking from the perspective of, feminism is ways to empower women, this is a face of feminism. It's a Muslim face. It's a Sharia-mindful face. They don't all have the same answers to everything, but it is a very different kind of face than the one that we assume is feminism when you look globally at the most vocal around the world. So this has already been said a little bit, but I want to add a little detail as far as some of the history, colonial and modern history of the kinds of things, and this is, again, similar to what I saw when I worked in the sort of international arena in '95 with the UN. So here's some strategy advice that I ended up coming up with. And that is, first of all, it is really important for secular Western feminists. I'm just going to use that as my placeholder because there's problematic with each of those words. But anyway, it's really important for that group of people, those who are not aware, I guess I'm going to say it this way, of the kind of Sharia mindfulness that I'm talking about, to be aware of our own history, our own Western history with regard to Muslim women in general and global empowerment of women in general. This idea that, she said, white women helping brown women against brown men. This is actually, it was part of the strategy of colonialism. It was actually used as part of the justifying rhetoric to justify colonialism. We have to get in there because we have to save these women from these terrible brown men. Layla Ahmed has written about it really well. She's already mentioned earlier. But the colonialist discourses of the 19th century really were relying on depicting Muslim women as oppressed, powerless, and so that's why we had to go in as the Victorian. So here's a quote from Layla Ahmed. Even as the Victorian male establishment devised theories to contest the claims of feminism and derided and rejected ideas of feminism and notions of men's oppressing women with respect to itself, in other words, what she's saying is these same men were against feminism in their own countries. One of the guys who was the leader of some of this work in Egypt, this British guy, he was the founder and sometime president of the men's opposition to women's suffrage back in England. So these are not feminists in our sense of the word. However, they, as Layla Ahmed says, They captured the language of feminism and redirected it in the surface of colonialism toward other men and the cultures of other men. It was here and in the combining of the languages of colonialism and feminism that the fusion between the issues of women and culture was created. More exactly, what was created was the fusion between the issues of women, their oppression, and the cultures of other men. The idea that other men in colonized societies or societies beyond the borders of the civilized West, oppressed women, was to be used in the rhetoric of colonialism to render morally justifiable its project of undermining or eradicating the cultures of colonized people. That is also a face of feminism. That is why when people say feminism, are you a feminist? Many people in formerly colonized places are like, blank, no, I am not. I know what those people did to my culture. I know their arrogant attitude that they had all the answers and they were going to change the entire educational system and all of the economics of my place. And by the way, took all of our resources and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Why do I want to be associated with them? Feminism is just an excuse for new colonialism. And so we need to be aware of this history and that this is the resonance. And, you know, Americans have not a very good memory, but other parts of the world tend to. They remember. It's very familiar to them. It's like yesterday when you walk around and say, oh yeah, America, this or that. We don't have, you know, that much of an appreciation of our own language and our own history. And this isn't American feminism when you're talking about colonialism, but as Hind says, we need to be aware of our own projects that pick up where that left off. Without the same self-critical third wave feminism that I'm used to with feminists. Like, oh, let's see what intersectionalities are here, and maybe we haven't included everyone. But when it comes to Sharia and Islam, there isn't a lot of self-critical evaluation among Western feminists. And so it's the same thing. It's just redirected to new, what many in the Muslim world would call new colonialist efforts. So she mentioned Afghanistan and Iraq. And yes, when the same visuals, the same tropes, the same stereotypes are trotted out again in service of whatever the current, you know, crisis du jour is. And so I mentioned Amina Lawal in Nigeria. She was a later case, after my case that I worked on, Bari Magazu. This one was more extreme because she had been married, and so she was under threat of actual stoning to death. So really got the human rights world very, very concerned. Women, Western feminists all over the place, sending diplomats there, all over the news. People's email feeds were filled with various protest letters and et cetera, et cetera. And so this is a description of the Save Amina Lawal campaign. What the point of this quote that I'm going to give you here is listen to the tropes and the same stereotypes that I was just describing. So this says, in the Save Amina Lawal campaign, in photographs she was consistently depicted with downcast eyes, swathed in her veil, baby in tow, silent, in need of saving. One commentator points out, the Western media's response to Sharia in Nigeria demonstrates the continued influence of the colonialist rhetoric and its focus on Ms. Lawal and other women sentenced to stoning. The intervention was couched in terms of saving a woman from the gender-oppressive religious regime. The letter-writing campaigns and interventions from interested foreign leaders all directed themselves to the Nigerian government and the Sharia courts, while Ms. Lawal herself remained an object to be written about, spoken for, or acted upon, with little agency or voice of her own. We're doing it again. We're doing it all over again, and what's so frustrating to me is they're oblivious, most people are oblivious to the fact they're doing it, and making it worse for the very women we are trying to help. So in my case with Baria, many of the people who were signing those petitions and really involved had no idea that actually they were the cause of her flogging. They would blame it on, oh, this crazy barbaric Sharia law, when in fact there was a potential of saving her within the language of Islamic law. And that was my argument that I was trying to make, which ultimately helped Amina Lawal. She was given clemency. She was acquitted in a Sharia court in Nigeria, not the secular Supreme Court, but it was a Sharia-based argument that actually ultimately saved her. And so the same thing happened. The Baobab, same group that was appealing to the world, please don't help, they did it again with Save Amina Lawal. Please stop this campaign. You are not helping us. You're making it harder. You're making it worse. What happens in this kind of dynamic is, I was going to quote from Laura Bush, but she mentioned Laura Bush. You know, I mean, it's the same thing. The media was filled with burqa-clad women. We have to save these women from the Taliban. Laura Bush herself describes the American push to help liberate Afghani women and children from the Taliban. She described that the war on terrorism was, quote, a fight for the rights and dignity of women. So it's, again, the same message, the same tropes, the same visuals, and the same we're rescuing you, without understanding that what this kind of repeat action is doing is, as I've observed it on my side, what it does in the Muslim community is it does this. you're either for Islam and against women's rights, or you're for women's rights and against Islam. And so what happened in Nigeria was that the people who were writing to help her, these various women, if you were trying to help her, you must have been co-opted by the West. You must be brainwashed. This can't be coming from an Islamic identity. They are using you to try to help her. So the space for Muslim women's activism was very, very squeezed. It was almost impossible to try to articulate that middle ground. So what these efforts are doing is actually stifling and disempowering the voices of Muslim women who want to articulate an Islamic law-based argument for women's empowerment. And by the way, many of the goals are quite much the same. There's a lot of things where we have common ground over what the goals are: education, poverty, financial empowerment, etc. There's lots of common ground, but yet the voice of doing this within Islamic law is being stifled and shut down because of this very aggressive, vocal Western feminist stuff. So I want to end with another story. And this is back to Pakistan. So I mentioned the Zina ordinance. Unlike Nigeria, Pakistan, the Pakistani community and the Pakistani law follows mostly the majority fiqh Islamic law doctrine that doesn't have extramarital sex as prima facie argument for a zina prosecution. In other words, you shouldn't be prosecuted just because you're pregnant. They actually, the Hanafi school literally emphasizes the 4 witnesses. You can't prosecute unless you've got those 4 eyewitnesses, and if you don't have them, it's a non-prosecution. The problem is, the twist here in Pakistan was that it made this, what I say, and many others say, is egregious mistake of requiring the same evidentiary rules, those 4 witnesses, for zina, for extramarital sex generally, and also for rape. So you need 4 eyewitnesses to prove rape. So this is where the public media headlines come out with Islamic law punishes rape victims. And that's where that's coming from. And I was appalled when I first heard this. I was really upset, and that's what motivated me to write that article right out of law school, critiquing on Islamic law grounds that this is actually upside down. And in fact, if you look at classical Islamic law, again, not reform, classical Islamic law, rape was never treated as a subcategory of zina. It's a crime of taking, if you actually fit it into any of the Hudud ordinance. It's a physical, or we would say today, a crime of violence, whereas zina is a crime of consent. It's consenting adults agreeing to do this thing, which is not sanctified by marriage. Okay, very different categories. When Pakistan did this, they merged the two. It's actually interesting for the colonial history. The language of the rape section is almost exactly word for word of the language of the old British colonial law in India. And so I just have this image of Zia's drafters sitting around going, okay, well, we got all of the zina stuff, and here's the criminal code. Oh, we got this rape thing over here. Where's this go? Well, it's sex, so, let's put it over here. I mean, it's the lack of thinking through what is the goal of the crime, what is really going on here, is a lack of thought. So this is a problem with the Islamic legal legislative process in general, as far as legislating Sharia for the whole country. But anyway, so it became virtually impossible in Pakistan to prosecute rapists because you had this 4-witness problem. And so it comes out, it's got the same kind of human rights activism, attacking, this is barbaric, you need to repeal the Hudud ordinance, you've got all kinds of entities, commissions that are drawn up in Pakistan itself, looking at this, many efforts to try to repeal these Hudud ordinance. Hudud means the Islamic criminal law. So try to repeal this whole entire thing. International, domestic, constant pressure to no avail. You have 27 years of stalemate. Nothing happens. There's lots of discussion, keeps going, nothing happens. More women are going to prison for various totally unjustifiably human rights documentation of this over and over and over again, nothing happens. Then this all changes in 2006 when a TV show in Pakistan, anyone know the TV show? It's called Zara Sochiye. Urdu speakers, what does that mean? Zara, just think a little bit. Zara, come on, just Sochiye, right? Think a little bit. So it's this TV show in Pakistan that airs a series of episodes on this question. It says, is the Hudud ordinance divine law? And it had this really pretty elaborate website where it had all kinds of things you could click on and read up on the question and read scholarly opinions and everything. It ultimately sparks a nationwide conversation about the zina laws in Pakistan, especially that requirement of the 4 eyewitnesses, and actually asking the question and breaking the myth that it would be sinful to amend this ordinance, that it would be un-Islamic to talk about changing it. Because what was happening was those people who were opposed to it and arguing for repeal were usually, and if they weren't, they were getting painted as, again, external Western feminists coming intruding on the activities of good Muslims. So by shifting the weight of influence on the Pakistani public of public opinion from religious, stalwarts who are defending the Hudud ordinances against all opposition, it actually does something different. It brings a different set of fiqh experts, of Islamic law experts, who look at the inconsistencies of the ordinance and the inconsistencies with classical Islamic law and actually start to ask the question from an educated Islamic law perspective. And soon after the show, there's a Pakistan's Council on Islamic Ideology, tasked by President Musharraf, reviews the ordinance, proposes several amendments. In November 2006, Pakistani Parliament passes the Women's Protection Act, which, among other things, moves rape prosecution outside of the Hudud ordinance into the ordinary criminal code, and it doesn't have the eyewitness proof. How did they do that? How were they able so quickly to change what had for 27 years not changed? I say, and the commentators I was reading on this, the key was its Sharia-mindful approach. The invited guests on the show didn't include any of the usual suspects that had been part of this conversation, much to their chagrin. Didn't have any women's rights groups, domestic or international, no representative of foreign non-governmental organizations at all, no academics other than Islamic scholars ranging from both all the way from conservative to moderate. That allowed the public conversation to have that allowed the conversation about the Hudud ordinance to have new Islamic credibility with the Muslim public. It gave its Muslim audience the ability to draw much more nuanced conclusions about this. Rather than defending it, they were able now to ask the question, wait a second, is this even Islamic in the first place? Whereas up until that point, that was one of those questions that had been stifled out of the conversation by this polarity that it had started. So you didn't have to take sides anymore in a pro-Sharia versus pro-women fight. The conversation was being had completely within a Sharia context. And now you can ask questions that aren't being asked otherwise. So I want to end with this. So think about strategy, right? I mean, it's important for the global feminist movement, human rights movement, women's rights movement, however, womanist, whatever you want to call it, to think about what are you doing that might actually be backfiring in your ultimate goal? And are the ultimate goals, some of them can be the same as the women that you're looking at. And so what are you doing that might actually be negatively affecting the goal? Focus on the goal, not who gets the credit and what voice it's in and how it's written and what the visuals are, but where is the goal and where are we going to find common ground? So with Femin not even interacting with the Tunisian women's rights groups, the local mosque women's groups, I'm sure that women's access to public space and mosque space after they were, visited by the Femin made it much harder for the local women to be distinguished when they're arguing for women's rights from the Femin protesters who are outside. Are you really helping the Muslim women that you're really caring about then? Probably not. So I hope that I've given a little bit of detail and given you a little bit more broader picture of some more of the faces of feminism. The particular one that I'm looking at, because that's my field, is those who are starting with Sharia as their beginning, their starting point. That's the beginning. And yet, still interested from a Western person, and yet, they're still interested in women's rights. From a Muslim perspective, of course we're still interested in women's rights. God gave me rights. This is what I'm doing. So it's important for all of the various faces of feminism to recognize that Sharia doesn't have to be the enemy. It can actually be one of the tools that we work with. But part of getting there is stop trying to rescue us. We don't really need rescuing. I would like for us to stand next to each other and walk forward with all our faces held high. Thank you.
The speakers sit up there. And if we can have people stand up and project so we can hear, since I don't think we can get the microphone out. So since we don't have a whole lot of time, let me just see if there are any questions from the audience. I'm prepared to ask some. I've been very fascinated by these things. Would anyone like to start? Yes.
Hi, I have a question.
Do you want to stand up and be loud? Yes, thank you.
My question is for either of you, but I know, Hind, that you have experience with this. I'm wondering if you could talk about the use of media to portray these negative stereotypes about Muslim women. And I know you mentioned Laura Bush, and when she was giving those excuses for invading various countries, There was this Amnesty International poster I remember seeing where women wearing burqas were next to garbage bags. And it was like, they looked the same, right? They were being equated. So I was wondering if you could talk about those things.
Sure. Is this, on? All right, great. Thank you for the question. Social media, I think, is really incredible in many ways. It can be positive and negative, but one of the really incredible positive things about it is that I think it has democratized the social square, or the public square. It's democratized it. It's allowed people who have previously might have had marginalized voices or felt like their voices were marginal. They now have a platform to connect with each other, to share their thoughts, and to kind of mobilize and activate on the ground in their real world kind of lives, as well as kind of raising awareness online. And I think what you find throughout throughout the world, and for Muslims, whether they're women or men, now you have, through social media and new telecommunications technologies, new platforms for people to share these ideas. And I think then what happens is sometimes people push back on that. And I'll give you a really concrete example. When I was introduced, one of the projects that was mentioned is a website that I run called Side Entrance, and it is essentially it's a Tumblr. Basically, it's crowdsourced, and what I do is I ask women and men around the world to share photographs and their stories and their experiences in mosques around the world. And so specifically around women and girls' experiences in these mosques, positive or negative. And although the reality is that I receive actually more positive or beautiful spaces and positive stories, the egregious ones are the ones that go viral, right? Like the picture with the women's space that has mold on the walls, or the picture of the garbage can in front of the women's entrance outside. Those are the ones that go viral, not the beautiful spaces, not the nice big kind of entrances or and the nice stories. So then I get the other pushback that you alluded to, Asifa, which is that some conservative people saying, well, you, Hind Makki, you are falling into the trap of the Islamophobes. You are airing dirty laundry, and you are not helping the situation because you're not working within the Muslim community. Well, first of all, obviously that's wrong. I am working within the Muslim community in various other platforms, but I think it's very interesting that the response is, this online public conversation is not something that should be taking place, and that they're still trying to marginalize and silence these voices that have found a platform. And I think here again, you still find at play this idea that any Muslim woman who tries to change a situation is seen as adopting foreign understandings of the religion, which, as Asifa eloquently mentioned, many of these rights that we are clamoring for are not new rights. These are actually rights that we're asking to be returned, essentially.
That's great. Before I forget, I mentioned that I wrote an article where I sort of summarized all my complaints and frustrations about this, and I have way too many physical hard copies because nobody uses paper anymore. So I brought them from my office, and so there's a bunch of them over there on that table if anyone wants it. It's called "What If Sharia Weren't the Enemy? Rethinking International Women's Rights Advocacy on Islamic Law."
I'll take that.
There's yours.
Thank you.
All right.
Yes,
Yeah.
in the back. Do you want to speak up a little?
Sister, what actually what you call feminism, but how would you react to that? Because that's coming from a Muslim, and she's actually just fighting for inclusion. Now, in the whole bigger picture of feminism, would you include that, or you would say she's just part of the Islamic feminism?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
So, are you asking about World Hijab Day? If that idea is a part of feminism,
Global feminism, or just part of just
of Islamic feminism? The way I actually see it is that and there are some of my Muslim women friends who wear hijab or who don't wear hijab actually are vehemently opposed to World Hijab Day because they believe that non-Muslim women who don't, believe in, the tenets of the faith and don't, are not Muslim and are often not, women of color, for one day you're not going to experience everything that Muslim women experience and believe and what have you. I also critiqued that day because I also think that, why, part of it is they're trying to raise awareness about the discrimination that Muslim women face in Western communities. And one of my pushbacks on that is, why not just take us at face value when we say to you that, yes, we experience some discrimination? Why do you have to experience it yourself or try to experience it yourself for one day? But really, I also dislike this narrative of victimization. And I think that sometimes Muslims fall into this as well. They say, oh, everybody, women are being attacked in the West, and it's because they're Muslim, and we're the victims, and we need saving. And so they're already setting up that narrative to say that Muslim women need saving, when Muslim women do not need saving. And, I think that those are some, real critiques about World Hijab Day. However, I also think it's pretty enormous to say that this is positive in the sense that you have millions or thousands of women around the world who are saying, I am trying to take a physical stand against discrimination, and I actually think that's a very positive thing, and I applaud them for that.
I think that the kind of third wave feminism that Hind was talking about includes the concept of walking a mile in somebody else's shoes. And I think anything that allows you to be aware of another person's experiences in whatever way, I think could be included as part of global feminism, as feminism in general. However, I think strategy-wise, I'm with Hind and some of these other critiques, from a Muslim strategy-wise. I, for a long time in hijab and veil or khimar, or whatever you want to call it, it's been a topic in my life since I was a child, and I've gone many, many ways on my own personal dress and my own thoughts about it. And what I've come to now is I'm tired of it being the focal point of how Muslim women are identified, both by Muslims and by non-Muslims. And the more attention we give to it, the more we are reduced to a piece of cloth. So why would that be the one thing that you're looking to have people understand what it's like to be a Muslim woman? And that's my critique of it, and it doesn't really have anything to do with what the definition of feminism it is. It's just sort of, how do we want to identify ourselves? Do we want to play into the same narrative that all we are really visually? When we were talking on email, I was like, I am waiting for the books on Muslim women, or even Islam in general, not to include a veil somewhere on the cover. I mean, that is the stereotypical trope. You can't publish it unless it's somewhere on there. I mean, there's a rare exception, but it has become the visual. And we are much, much, much more than that.
Yes. So I know this event is kind of entitled,
Can you
Feminist?
and speak up a little? Thank you.
I know this event is kind of entitled Many Faces of Feminism. I feel like that's a direct elaboration on kind of this hegemonic feminism that we've already kind of encountered. Blanket secularist, or I would call it white feminism. Just putting that out there. So I was wondering if you could comment on how white feminism organizes identities of feminism, and how discourses of Islamic feminism, or what I'm discussing about books, are now kind of emerging or have emerged as counter-hegemonic forms of feminism and not.
It sounds like you can say a lot
Yeah,
about
I know,
that
yeah.
yourself. I'll take a stab at it, and then I'll give it to Asifa. But I think one of the things that is really critical for us to think about, us as Americans to think about, is oftentimes what we consider is a cultural norm is actually quite specific to a white Protestant Christian experience. And what you are terming as white feminism, they're coming out of that particular experience, and then also in addition from a higher class of upper class, economic class of women, who then have different priorities than anyone else, right? I mean, they have their priorities in terms of, how am I equal to my well-off husband? And they're not really thinking about what are the wages that I'm being paid for the work that I'm doing. They're working out of gendered norms that are coming out of Protestant Christianity. And then the critique that I have, that I assume that you also have, is that they're then universalizing their experiences from that particular, trajectory and saying, all women across the board must have the same exact problem that I have with my religion and my culture and the way patriarchy and hierarchical norms of gender in my community and my culture background. And I think that's the important thing. As America becomes more and more diverse in terms of religion, in terms of race, in terms of even terms of questions of Christianity, right? I mean, now we have a huge influx of conservative Catholics coming and conservative evangelicals coming from Latin America, changing the question of what does it mean to be an American Christian, right? And as we become more and more diverse, I think it's critical to think about how are people in the majority realizing that their cultural norms are not normative. Their cultural history is not normative. Their critiques with their religious and cultural and ethnic history is not normative. And therefore, the strategies, as Asifa keeps bringing up, cannot be the same. And neither is the question or the problem the same across the board either. I didn't use the word hegemonic though.
I'm not sure if this answers your question, but it's what your question sparked in me, and that is another frustration that I've had. It's sort of my venting night.
Bring it on.
Is that I have seen an improvement in, to be fair, I've seen an improvement among many writers in women's studies in general. Some of the people that Professor Orloff knows too, is trying really hard to be open to expanding this third wave intersectionality to including Muslim women. And so that's a good thing, but I am also frustrated, and this somewhat goes to what you were saying, is that it seems that the Muslim women they're looking to put up as examples of this are ones that look as much like them in their ideology as possible. Mm-hmm. It's really not questioning my own prioritization of issues and allowing somebody else to get in the conversation and changing the conversation, but rather picking people who look like they're arguing for the same things I'm looking for. So, not to make you look bad or anything, but Fatima Mernissi is often listed as, oh, Muslim women as feminists. I'm sorry, Fatima Mernissi does not have a lot of traction within practicing conservative religious Muslim communities. She's interesting, I learned a lot from her, but you're not going to get very far if you will keep mentioning Fatima Mernissi as a way to empower Muslim women within a Muslim community. And it's because she fits a lot of what we Westerners are looking for as who she is and what she's about. She herself says, I didn't get an Arabic Islamic education. I don't have the tools to do the kind of stuff I'm talking about. The women who actually are really and there's not just one monolith of this, but the women who are examples of the kind of stuff that we're talking about usually are completely off the radar when it comes to Western feminists, global feminists, even those who are trying to be open-minded, they don't even know where to look. And if they're looking right at you, they don't see you. Because you don't look and act and behave in ways that they're looking for. So what they think of as empowered is different. And that's a bigger conversation, and that's not just something that Muslims and Muslim women are dealing with. Racial minorities, the dominant, what is empowerment, what is strength, what is weakness, all of this is part of, a global conversation. How much do you want to change the paradigm by changing the hegemony that's owned it for so long? And are we willing to really change the conversation, or we just want a few tokens to be part of the conversation but look like those other people over there? Yes. Mm-hmm.
Speak up. I have a question for you.
Got it.
In cases in which, like, the federal law and Sharia law are sometimes considered at odds, and especially when it seems like they're disproportionately affecting women negatively, like in terms of like divorce.
Talking about here in the United States?
No, not in other countries. Like,
okay.
For instance, maybe like Ethiopia that operates on
okay.
federal law, customary law, and Sharia law.
Mm-hmm.
Would you say that in the same ways that kind of Western NGOs and feminist groups end up hurting rather than helping a lot of the women, would you say that advocacy groups for legal reform and legal reformists in some of these other countries that are kind of trying to push women away from using the Sharia courts and use the federal courts instead, or water down like the potency of the Sharia courts, would you say that they're also hurting rather than helping when they could be trying to reform Islamic law within the Sharia courts instead of trying to phase it out?
Great question. Are you law student? Pre-law student? No? Pre-law, yeah. Come to Wisconsin. That's a great question, and it gets very much into my other work, which is really my focus of my research right now, which is really Islamic government, Islamic constitutionalism, and what is the role of Islamic law in legislation, in government in Muslim-majority countries. So I can't really, I could go a whole another 2 hours on really answering your question. I have a problem with the idea of legislating Islamic law in general, and then having Sharia courts implement it. In a nutshell, it loses the pluralism that Islamic law is inherently, the diversity of schools of thought. If you legislate it, you end up picking one, and that applies to everything. And giving a Sharia court, one Sharia court, or even a system of appellate Sharia courts, gives an authority to one entity to declare what Islamic law is for an entire country that really isn't our history. We haven't had an entity, we don't have a church, there's no Muslim entity that describes what the Islamic law answer for a certain geographic population is. So this whole enterprise is actually, I think, there's ways to do it better than the typical way that's being done now. Part of what a way to do it better is to create a different constitutional structure that would allow for reform of Islamic law and maybe not reform of Islamic law. You would have a choice of which Islamic law you want to operate on yourself. And so those who are more comfortable with the classical, established law could, but if I'm interested in more of a, this interpretation that's different from the classical one, I could also go there. That takes a lot of rethinking of constitutional structure and legal authority and access to, basically it's a project of legal pluralism at a constitutional level. So that's what I'm working on right now. And so that would allow some of what you're talking about. But I do think the way to get your rights is to go to the secular court, I think hurts the ability of Muslims to think that Islamic law has the answers to deal with, our reality. And if that is the only way that women can get their rights, I think that hurts Islamic law. And we should be dealing with this stuff within the Islamic legal system as well as the secular legal system. I think both can deal with this simultaneously.
So it sounds like you're talking from a Sunni perspective. Is there a difference within the Shia legal system?
So yes, to be fair, within the Shia legal system, the law, what? There is more hierarchy. It's still not to the extent of the clerical, they use the word cleric in English, but it's really not the same as clergy in Christian hierarchy. There's much more structure to how you would gain your legal education, so it's a bit more, that way it's a bit more structured. But there's still the idea that it's, after the imams are gone, there's still individual human beings who are fallible, who are doing the interpretation, the ijtihad, and so you still have the potential for different interpretations. And in fact, in Shia, in Ja'fari madhab, there are different interpretations historically. So, it's not the same, but it is similar enough that some of what I'm working on would still work. Yeah. So, and Iran is not what I'm talking about, just to be clear.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Questions? Well, I have one.
Yeah.
Which is, I found the talks really fascinating, and I'm very mindful of the need for these conversations, and certainly learning history is a big piece of what I think Americans need to do. Where do we have, seriously, I'm sort of having flashbacks because I teach a gender policy and politics class in this very room. And often my students are asking, why are you giving, I have like world maps of colonialism to talk about the U.S. because I think, how can you really talk about the U.S. without this? But anyway, that's aside from it. Where do we have these conversations? Because I feel as though many people held out hope for the UN or international organizations to be the meeting space for these discussions. But I think you're quite right about the kind of fundamentally secular set of assumptions that go into the human rights approach. And I can see where that isn't going to encompass a large enough group in the conversation. But I actually don't know, where do you have those conversations? So, curious.
Well, I've observed them more organically on the ground. That's not a great answer because it's so different depending on what you're talking about and where you're talking about. But I mentioned, just to give an example, Bayabab, the one of the legal advocacy groups in Nigeria working on these cases. Aisha Imam has publicly said, we want any of the tools that are available to us. They're not against using Islamic law. They're not against using secular. They're interested in experts coming to them from all places and very open to a really multidisciplinary kind of approach to their work. So that, I would love to see that attitude replicated in many of the NGOs that are dealing with some of these issues around the world, that I'm not going to have an allergic reaction if you say, well, in Sharia it says. I mean, it would be really helpful if we could talk about that and not have the assumptions that, okay, you've already sold yourself out, you're no longer really a feminist if you're wearing a scarf, if you're talking about Islamic law, if you want to break to pray, I mean, there needs to be an assessment one-on-one between people, and I hope that then it would grow to a more institutional level. That's not a thorough answer, but yeah.
Well, I mean, I would echo it. I think I've seen it also in the grassroots. As I mentioned, my family's from Sudan, and there has been for years and years and years efforts on the ground to address, challenge, and then eradicate FGM, female genital mutilation, which is a cultural practice practiced by Muslims as well as Christians, Coptic Christians in Sudan. But is not obviously sanctioned by, I should say obviously, I think it's pretty obvious that it's not sanctioned by Islam. However, people have taken that and it's been very difficult to address it because the secular groups, didn't want to use Islam at all as a way to stop it. And so for like the last maybe 15 years or so, there has been, and it's 15 years because it's still very difficult to get everybody to get on the same page about this. But the government, which is an Islamic government, it's not democratically elected, it's an Islamist outlook government, is working with civil society, with doctors and medical students, as well as with imams. And they actually have programs that are sanctioned by supported by the government, but have erupted from the ground up. Women's rights groups, and mainly really doctors and the religious leaders who go around to rural areas in Sudan, and they explain about what actually FGM is, what it does to women's bodies, but also how it is not compatible with Islam. And there's, there are, grassroots programs and campaigns to say, well, we want to kind of petition for our girls to basically be whole. And so there's actually a campaign, I saw this on TV, the Sudan TV a few days ago, that is like the Whole Girl campaign. And so parents and girls and families and like clan leaders will literally sign a petition or sign, a form and say, I'm so-and-so, the father of so-and-so who's 6 years old, and I'm signing on her behalf because I believe that she should be a whole girl. And, and this is something that did not actually get traction when it was completely secular. As soon as you bring in the religious scholars as well as the doctors into it, and Sudanese people and not people from abroad, that's when you began to see change, and are beginning to see change, hopefully.
Let me just add to that. I mean, I think that if we're serious about that, I think that we've both said there's a lot of places where there's common ground, and we agree on the goal of getting rid of FGM, and so what are the various strategies that are the most effective way of doing that? And if it doesn't look like the way I would like it to look, I don't care, because my goal is to get rid of it. And so I'm willing to tolerate the language change because that's my goal. But I think this is part of the paradigm shift, is I think that if we are going to bring in religious voices, and that's not just Muslim religious voices, that's everybody's religious voices and other ideological bases of thinking that's not purely secular, then that means we need to be honest that there may be areas where we don't have common ground. And I think that that's okay. I think let's just know where those areas are instead of trying to force, round pegs into square holes and then forget about the consequences until they come back to bite you, to mix a bunch of metaphors. But I think that that's one of the things we tend not to do. We want universal Declaration of Human Rights, and that's stifle out anything that's really not on board with us. But they're still there. There's still values there. They're still out there. And so they're going to find ways to express themselves. And if we can get everything more out in the open and say, okay, we all agree on this. We don't all agree on that. Now what? And I think that would be an improvement.
Stand up and
Speak up if you would.
I guess can you guys hear me? Yeah. Okay, great. I don't have to stand up. This is about strategic strategies when it comes to using Sharia law. A lot of times there are different interpretations of it out there that are in the minority that will prove your point, but they're not authentic, or they're not seen as authentic. So, for example, if I want to argue something within an Islamic setting, and I come from a minority, like Shia fiqh of one mujtahid that only a few thousand people practice, but it's using the Quran, it's using Hadith, and it's explaining that it's not going to be taken seriously.
By the majority, it's not going to be taken
By
seriously.
the majority. And a lot of times, I mean, you gave the example of Pakistan, you just kind of, I don't mean to say it in a malicious way, but you kind of threw it off like a joke, you know, oh, for 27 years there's a stalemate, and they didn't even realize that, oh, it's Islamically like this. Well, a lot of the times those people have malicious intent. They have the Islamic proof. They have people fighting them Islamically, but they don't want to do it. They're hiding behind those verses, the ones that their interpretation makes up for it, to push that agenda. So how do you go about fighting for something which has a legal, like which has the Islamic interpretation, but is a minority or not seen as authentic?
So that's a great question. Something that is hard, even for me, when I first started studying Islamic law, to really embrace, but now I've found it's actually really empowering, is living with difference. And the fact is that there are many areas of Islamic law, even if you take the majority of the established schools, that this school thinks A and this school thinks B, and they're not going to convince each other to change their mind. And the thing that I find so interesting about Islamic law as a religious legal system is that it found a way to construct a system around that level of difference and tolerating that difference living next to each other. So it's true that if you choose to follow a minority opinion, not just a Shia minority opinion, it could be a minority opinion that isn't really recognized, that you found it in a book somewhere, there were 100 people in Damascus in whatever year that followed it, and you find that fits for you. And honestly, the way Islamic law works is it's just between you and God as to why you picked the school that you're going to follow, and so you choose to follow it. Chances are you're not probably going to be able to convince a lot of other people that you're right or that they should follow that too. But that's okay. I mean, it's really about what's comfortable for you in your life. And if you're comfortable following something that is really different from the norm, then there isn't anything Islamically wrong with that. As long as you found, it's following an established jihad rule, that is all that is important. That is the only thing that is needed for someone to feel confident that they're following Sharia, is to follow something that is a result of ijtihad by somebody. But it doesn't have to be the majority opinion, right? And so you can go get a fatwa from this person, get a fatwa from that person. A fatwa is not binding in itself. You choose to follow it, right? So I choose to follow minority opinion. I'm not going to get any traction. Okay, as an individual, I'm not going to get very far. As a movement, as a women's rights movement, you may also not get very far. You may get a few changes. You may not get everybody on board, which is why I mentioned all the classically majority established stuff that you can still use for women's rights. Because if you only rely on minority, new, reform approaches, you're not going to make the kind of change that we would like to see across the board.
How are you defining class?
The established 4 schools, if you look at the established collections of fiqh of all of the 4 Sunni schools, the Jafari school, the established rules of fiqh within those schools. Not modern reform like, let's rethink the rules on, child custody or something, which is happening in the modern era, which started really with, colonial, post-colonial reform work. So, yeah. So I think that it goes back to some of the stuff I was talking about. I'm not sure if you're talking at a personal level or an activist level, but activist level. So if you're talking about trying to get change at an activist level, you're not going to get change that's going to legislate for everybody. And I'm actually okay with that. That's why I was talking about my Islamic constitutionalism stuff is really not about Islamic legislation. It's about opening up options for people by education about Islamic law. So I also didn't mean to say that in Pakistan they didn't know that it was against Islamic law. There was a conversation within. I published my article in Pakistan by the Islamic Studies Journal out of Islamabad, and it was my critique of the actual ordinance. But you're right that there were some people with a vested interest in keeping the rule as it was. The problem is what they were keeping was a rule that wasn't even classically established. It was this weird permutation, this morphing of the legislation of rules that they mixed a bunch of stuff together. So that holding on to the 4 witnesses for rape is not the same thing as insisting on a divorce, access to divorce that doesn't give women the same access to divorce. Because the first one doesn't even have any basis in Islamic classical established law. The second one does. And you would be operating against years of established custom and consensus and practice that does have a lot of traction. So you change the minds of those who you can change, and the ones you can't, you leave it, and you try to educate with the tools that you already have that they will accept. That would be my strategy thing for the activism. I talked way too long on that one. So.
We're about out of time. I just wanted to say, do you want to have a last word before we
Since I
conclude?
have too many last words.
Any thoughts that you'd like to throw out?
I'll return back to this sort of the democratization of the internet, and also not just the internet, but just the age that we're living in, where people are, it's accepted that, people are allowed to sort of share their perspectives, and that we learn from each other to do that. I remember I just read this article a couple of days ago about a Moroccan author who does not wear hijab. She is Muslim. She identifies as a Muslim. And she said that when she first came to the United States, she kept seeing in the bookstores something that she described as the Chronicles of the Veil, because it's the type of the book that she would see is a Muslim woman who has, found oppression and repression under Islam from a husband or a father or a culture. She comes to America or the West, and she gets rid of the veil and finds liberation and freedom and love and happiness and joy and sparkles and sunshine. And for Lalami, she just thought this was so strange because in Morocco, where she's from, which is a Muslim country, a traditional North African, Arab, Berber Muslim country, when she goes to the bookstores, and if she sees anything about women, it's usually about, access to women's education in the rural areas of Morocco, or about Islamic law and divorce rights and custody rights. It's about, literature and like the female Arab voice in post-colonial literature. And I think, and what she's saying is that we're more than just chronicles of the veil, right? And we are actually, thankfully, in a place and in a time and an era where not only, are we living in a country that protects and promotes, freedom of speech, but we're also in a time in the world where we have platforms and we have access to do that through social media, through regular media, and through your studies here. So go out and change the world, you guys.
Nice note to end on, so join me in thanking this.